You're listening to Midwest Coven Cast Presents Weekend Reads. I'm Marilyn of Midwest Coven Cast. Here in Season 3 of Weekend Reads, we will be making our way through the 1922 abridgment of Sir James Frazer's The Golden Bough. You can visit MidwestCovenCast.com to find podcast extras, including a free online copy of the text. Consider supporting Midwest Coven Cast and Weekend Reads on Patreon for access to additional materials, like a serialized official Midwest Coven Cast Presents Weekend Reads ebook with additional notes about the text and some editorial modernizations straight from, well, me. Now, Coven, it is time to cozy up with your coffee or tea and enjoy this episode of Weekend Reads. Chapter 35, Attis as a God of Vegetation. The original character of Attis as a tree spirit is brought out plainly by the part which the pine tree plays in his legend, his ritual, and his monuments. The story that he was a human being transformed into a pine tree is only one of those transparent attempts at rationalizing old beliefs which meet us so frequently in mythology. The bringing in of the pine tree from the woods decked with violets and woolen bands is like bringing in the May tree or summer tree in modern folk custom, and the effigy which was attached to the pine tree was only a duplicate representative of the tree spirit Attis. After being fastened to the tree, the effigy was kept for a year and then burned. The same thing appears to have been sometimes done with the maypole. And in like manner, the effigy of the corn spirit made at harvest is often preserved till it is replaced by a new effigy at the next year's harvest. The original intention of such customs was no doubt to maintain the spirit of vegetation in life throughout the year. Why the Frisians should have worshipped the pine above other trees we can only guess. Perhaps the sight of its changeless, though somber green cresting, the ridges of the high hills above the fading splendor of the autumn woods in the valleys, may have seemed to their eyes to mark it out as the seed of a diviner life, of something exempt from the sad vicissitudes of the seasons, constant and eternal as the sky which stooped to meet it. For the same reason, perhaps, ivy was sacred to Attis. At all events, we read that his eunuch priests were tattooed with a pattern of ivy leaves. Another reason for the sanctity of the pine may have been its usefulness. The cones of the stone pine contain edible nut-like seeds, which have been used as food since antiquity, and are still eaten, for example, by the poorer classes in Rome. Moreover, a wine was brewed from these seeds, and this may partly account for the orgiastic nature of the rites of Cybele, which the ancients compared to those of Dionysus. Further, pine cones were regarded as symbols, or rather instruments, of fertility. Hence, at the festival of Thesmophoria, they were thrown, along with pigs and other ancients, or emblems of fecundity, into the sacred vaults of Demeter for the purpose of quickening the ground and the wombs of women. Like tree spirits in general, Attis was apparently thought to wield power over the fruits of the earth, or even to be identical with the corn. One of his epithets was very fruitful. He was addressed as the reaped green or yellow ear of corn, and the story of his sufferings, death, and resurrection was interpreted as the ripe grain wounded by the reaper, buried in the granary, and coming to life again when it is sown to the ground. A statue of him in the Lateran Museum at Rome clearly indicates his relation to the fruits of the earth, and particularly to the corn, for it represents him with a bunch of ears of corn and fruit in his hand, and a wreath of pine cones, pomegranates, and other fruits on his head, while from the top of his Frisian cap ears of corn are sprouting. On a stone urn, which contains the ashes of an Archigallus, or high priest of Attis, the same idea is expressed in a slightly different way. The top of the urn is adorned with ears of corn carved in relief, and it is surmounted by the figure of a cock, whose tail consists of ears of corn. Cybele, in like manner, was conceived as a goddess of fertility, who could make or mar the fruits of the earth, for the people of Augusta Dunham, Autun, in Gaul, used to cart her image about in a wagon for the good of the fields and vineyards, while they danced and sang before it, and we have seen that in Italy an unusually fine harvest was attributed to the recent arrival of the Great Mother. The bathing of the image of the goddess in a river may well have been a rain charm to ensure an abundant supply of moisture for the crops. Chapter 34. Human Representatives of Attis. From inscriptions, it appears that both at Pessinus and Rome, the high priest of Cybele regularly bore the name of Attis. It is therefore a reasonable conjecture that he played the part of his namesake. the legendary Attis, at the annual festival. We have seen that on the Day of Blood, he drew blood from his arms, and this may have been an imitation of the self-inflicted death of Attis under the pine tree. It is not inconsistent with this supposition that Attis was also represented at these ceremonies by an effigy, for instances can be shown in which the divine being is first represented by a living person and afterwards by an effigy, which is then burned or otherwise destroyed. Perhaps we may go a step farther and conjecture that this mimic killing of the priest, accompanied by a real effusion of his blood, was in Frisia, as it has been elsewhere, a substitute for a human sacrifice, which in earlier times was actually offered. A reminiscence of the manner in which these old representatives of the deity were put to death is perhaps preserved in the famous story of Marsyas. He was said to be a Frisian satyr or Silenus, according to others a shepherd or a herdsman who played sweetly on the flute. A friend of Sibyl, he roamed the country with the disconsolate goddess to soothe her grief for the death of Attis. This composition of the mother's air, a tune played on the flute in honor of the great mother goddess, was attributed to him by the people of Selene in Phrygia. Vain of his skill, he challenged Apollo to a musical contest, he to play on the flute, and Apollo on the lyre. Being vanquished, Marsyas was tied up to a pine tree and flayed or cut limb from limb, either by the victorious Apollo or by a Scythian slave. His skin was shown at Selene in historical times. It hung at the foot of the citadel in a cave from which the river Marsyas rushed with an impetuous and noisy tide to join the meander. So the Adonis burst full-born from the precipices of the Lebanon. So the blue river of Ibris leaps in a crystal jet from the red rocks of the Taurus. So the stream, which now rumbles deep underground, used to gleam for a moment on its passage from darkness to darkness in the dim light of the Corician cave. And all these copious fountains, with their glad promise of fertility and life, men of old saw the hand of God, and worshipped him beside the rushing river with the music of its tumbling waters in their ears. In Selene, if we can trust tradition, the piper Marsyas, hanging in his cave, had a soul for harmony even in death. For it is said that at the sound of his native Frisian melodies the skin of the dead satyr used to thrill, but that if the musicians struck up an air in praise of Apollo, it remained deaf and motionless. In the Frisian satyr, shepherd or herdsman who enjoyed the friendship of Sibyl practiced the music so characteristic of her rites and died a violent death on her sacred tree, the pine. May we not detect a close resemblance to Attis, the favorite shepherd or herdsman of the goddess, who is himself described as a piper, is said to have perished under a pine tree, and was annually represented by an effigy hung, like Marsyas, upon a pine? We may conjecture that in old days the priest who bore the name and played the part of Attis at the spring festival of Sibyl was regularly hanged or otherwise slain upon the sacred tree, and that this barbarous custom was afterwards mitigated into the form in which it is known to us in later times, when the priest merely drew blood from his body under the tree and attached an effigy instead of himself to its trunk. In the holy grove at Uppsala, men and animals were sacrificed by being hanged upon the sacred trees. The human victims dedicated to Odin were regularly put to death by hanging or by a combination of hanging and stabbing, the man being strung up to a tree or gallows and then wounded with a spear. Hence Odin was called the Lord of the Gallows, or the God of the Hanged, and he is represented sitting under a gallows tree. Indeed, he is said to have been sacrificed to himself in the ordinary way, as we learn from the weird verses of the Havamal, in which the god describes how he acquired his divine power by learning the magic runes. I know that I hung on the windy tree for 9 whole nights, wounded with the spear dedicated to Odin, myself to myself. The Bagaboos of Mindanao, one of the Philippine Islands, used annually to sacrifice human victims for the good of the crops in a similar way. Early in December, when the constellation Orion appeared at 7 o'clock in the evening, the people knew that the time had come to clear their fields for sowing and to sacrifice a slave. The sacrifice was presented to certain powerful spirits as payment for the good year which the people had enjoyed, and to ensure the favor of the spirits for the coming season. The victim was led to a great tree in the forest. There he was tied with his back to the tree and his arms stretched high above his head. in the attitude in which ancient artists portrayed Marsyas hanging on the fatal tree. While he thus hung by the arms, he was slain by a spear thrust through his body at the level of the armpits. Afterwards, the body was cut clean through the middle at the waist, and the upper part was apparently allowed to dangle for a little from the tree, while the under part wallowed in blood on the ground. The two portions were finally cast into a shallow trench beside the tree. Before this was done, anybody who wished might cut off a piece of flesh or a lock of hair from the corpse and carry it to the grave of some relation whose body was being consumed by a ghoul. Attracted by the fresh corpse, the ghoul would leave the moldering old body in peace. These sacrifices have been offered by men now living. In Greece, the great goddess Artemis herself appears to have been annually hanged in effigy in her sacred grove of Condylea among the Arcadian hills, and there, accordingly, she went by the name of the Hanged One. Indeed, a trace of a similar rite may perhaps be detected even at Ephesus, the most famous of her sanctuaries, in the legend of a woman who hanged herself and was thereupon dressed by the compassionate goddess in her own divine garb and called by the name of Hecate. Similarly, at Melite in Phthia, a story was told of a girl named Aspalis who hanged herself, but who appears to have been merely a form of Artemis. For after her death, her body could not be found, but an image of her was discovered standing beside the image of Artemis, and the people bestowed on it the title of Hekarge, or far-shooter, one of the regular epithets of the goddess. Every year the virgins sacrificed a young goat to the image by hanging it, because Aspalis was said to have hanged herself. The sacrifice may have been a substitute for hanging an image or a human representative of Artemis. Again, in Rhodes, the fair Helen was worshipped under the title of Helen of the Tree, because the queen of the island had caused her handmaids, disguised as Furies, to string her up to a bough. That the Asiatic Greeks sacrificed animals in this fashion is proved by coins of Ilium, which represent an ox or cow hanged on a tree and stabbed with a knife by a man who sits among the branches or on the animal's back. At Hierapolis, also, the victims were hung on trees before they were burnt. With these Greek and Scandinavian parallels before us, we can hardly dismiss as wholly improbable the conjecture that in Phrygia, a man-god may have hung year by year on the sacred but fatal tree. Chapter 37. Oriental Religions in the West. The worship of the Great Mother of the Gods and her lover or son was very popular under the Roman Empire. Inscriptions prove that the two received divine honors, separately or conjointly, not only in Italy and especially at Rome, but also in the provinces, particularly in Africa, Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, and Bulgaria. Their worship survived the establishment of Christianity by Constantine, for Symmachus records the recurrence of the festival of the Great Mother, and in the days of Augustine her effeminate priests still paraded the streets and squares of Carthage with whitened faces, scented hair, and mincing gait, while, like the mendicant friars of the Middle Ages, they begged alms from the passers-by. In Greece, on the other hand, the bloody orgies of the Asiatic goddess and her consort appear to have found little favor. The barbarous and cruel character of the worship, with its frantic excesses, was doubtless repugnant to the good taste and humanity of the Greeks, who seem to have preferred the kindred but gentler rites of Adonis. Yet the same features which shocked and repelled the Greeks may have positively attracted the less refined Romans and barbarians of the West. The ecstatic frenzies which were mistaken for divine inspiration, the mangling of the body, the theory of a new birth, and the remission of sins through the shedding of blood, have all their origin in savagery, and they naturally appealed to peoples in whom the savage instincts were still strong. Their true character was indeed often disguised under a decent veil of allegorical or philosophical interpretation, which probably sufficed to impose upon the rapt and enthusiastic worshippers, reconciling even the more cultivated of them to things which otherwise must have filled them with horror and disgust. The religion of the Great Mother was its curious blending of crude savagery with spiritual aspirations, was one of a multitude of similar Oriental faiths, which in the later days of paganism spread over the Roman Empire, and by saturating the European peoples with alien ideals of life gradually undermined the whole fabric of ancient civilization. Greek and Roman society was built on the conception of the subordination of the individual to the community, of the citizen to the state. It set the safety of the commonwealth as the supreme aim of conduct above the safety of the individual, whether in this world or in the world to come. Trained from infancy in this unselfish ideal, the citizens devoted their lives to the public service and were ready to lay them down for the common good. Or if they shrank from the supreme sacrifice, it never occurred to them that they acted otherwise than basely in preferring their personal existence to the interests of their country. All this was changed by the spread of Oriental religions, which inculcated the communion of the soul with God and its eternal salvation as the only objects worth living for, objects in comparison with which the prosperity and even the existence of the state sank into insignificance. The inevitable result of this selfish and immoral doctrine was to withdraw the devotee more and more from the public service, to concentrate his thoughts on his own spiritual emotions, and to breed in him a contempt for the present life, which he regarded merely as a probation for a better and an eternal. The saint and the recluse, disdainful of earth and wrapped in ecstatic contemplation of heaven, became in popular opinion the highest ideal of humanity, displacing the old ideal of the patriot and hero who, forgetful of self, lives and is ready to die for the good of his country. The earthly city seemed poor and contemptible to men whose eyes behold the city of God coming in the clouds of heaven. Thus, the center of gravity, so to say, was shifted from the present to a future life, and however much the other world may have gained, there can be little doubt that this one lost heavily by the change. A general disintegration of the body politic set in, the ties of the state and the family were loosened, the structure of society tended to resolve itself into its individual elements, and thereby to relapse into barbarism, for civilization is only possible through the active cooperation of the citizens and their willingness to subordinate their private interests to the common good. Men refused to defend their country and even to continue their kind. In their anxiety to save their own souls and the souls of others, they were content to leave the material world, which they identified with the principle of evil, to perish around them. This obsession lasted for 1,000 years. The revival of Roman law, of the Aristotelian philosophy, of ancient art and literature at the close of the Middle Ages, marked the return of Europe to native ideals of life and conduct, to saner, manlier views of the world. The long halt in the march of civilization was over. The tide of Oriental invasion had turned at last. It is ebbing still. Among the gods of Eastern origin, who in the decline of the ancient world competed against each other for the allegiance of the West, was the old Persian deity Mithra. The immense popularity of his worship is attested by the monuments illustrative of it, which have been found scattered in profusion all over the Roman Empire. In respect both of doctrines and of rites, the cult of Mithra appears to have presented many points of resemblance not only to the religion of the Mother of the Gods, but also to Christianity. The similarity struck the Christian doctors themselves, and was explained by them as a work of the devil, who sought to seduce the souls of men from the true faith by a false and insidious imitation of it. So, to the Spanish conquerors of Mexico and Peru, many of the native heathen rites appear to be diabolical counterfeits of the Christian sacraments. With more probability, the modern student of comparative religion traces such resemblances to the similar and independent workings of the mind of man in his sincere, if crude, attempts to fathom the secret of the universe, and to adjust his little life to its awful mysteries. However that may be, there can be no doubt that the Mithraic religion proved a formidable rival to Christianity, combining, as it did, a solemn ritual with aspirations after moral purity and a hope of immortality. Indeed, the issue of the conflict between the two faiths appears for a time to have hung in the balance. An instructive relic of the long struggle is preserved in our festival of Christmas, which the Church seems to have borrowed directly from its heathen rival. In the Julian calendar, the 25th of December was reckoned the winter solstice, and it was regarded as the nativity of the sun, because the day begins to lengthen and the power of the sun to increase from that turning point of the year. The ritual of the Nativity, as it appears to have been celebrated in Syria and Egypt, was remarkable. The celebrants retired into certain inner shrines, from which, at midnight, they issued with a loud cry, "The Virgin has brought forth! The light is waxing!" The Egyptians even represented the new-born sun by the image of an infant, which on his birthday, the winter solstice, they brought forth and exhibited to his worshippers. No doubt the Virgin, who thus conceived and bore a son on the 25th of December, was the great Oriental goddess, whom the Semites called the Heavenly Virgin, or simply the Heavenly Goddess. In Semitic lands, she was a form of Astarte. Now Mithra was regularly identified by his worshippers with the sun, the unconquered sun, as they called him. Hence, his nativity also fell on the 25th of December. The Gospels say nothing as to the day of Christ's birth, and accordingly the early church did not celebrate it. In time, however, the Christians of Egypt came to regard the 6th of January as the date of the Nativity, and the custom of commemorating the birth of the Savior on that day gradually spread until by the 4th century it was universally established in the East. But at the end of the 3rd or the beginning of the 4th century, the Western Church, which had never recognized the 6th of January as the day of the Nativity, adopted the 25th of December as the true date, and in time its decision was accepted also by the Eastern Church. At Antioch, the change was not introduced till about the year 375 A.D. What considerations led the ecclesiastical authorities to institute the festival of Christmas? The motives for the innovation are stated with great frankness by a Syrian writer himself, a Christian. The reason, he tells us, why the fathers transferred the celebration of the 6th of January to 25th of December was this. It was a custom of the heathen to celebrate on the same 25th of December the birthday of the sun, at which they kindled lights in token of festivity. In these solemnities and festivities the Christians also took part. Accordingly, when the doctors of the church perceived that the Christians had a leaning to this festival, they took counsel and resolved that the true nativity should be solemnized on that day, and the festival of the Epiphany on the 6th of January. Accordingly, along with this custom, the practice has prevailed of kindling fires till the 6th. The heathen origin of Christmas is plainly hinted at, if not tacitly admitted, by Augustine, when he exhorts his Christian brethren not to celebrate that solemn day like the heathen on account of the sun, but on account of him who made the sun. In like manner, Leo the Great rebuked the pestilent belief that Christmas was solemnized because of the birth of the new sun. It was called, and not because of the nativity of Christ. Thus, it appears that the Christian Church chose to celebrate the birthday of its founder on the 25th of December in order to transfer the devotion of the heathen from the sun to him who was called the Son of Righteousness. If that was so, there can be no intrinsic improbability in the conjecture that motives of the same sort may have led the ecclesiastical authorities to assimilate the Easter festival of the death and resurrection of their Lord to the festival of the death and resurrection of another Asiatic god, which fell at the same season. Now the Easter rites, still observed in Greece, Sicily, and southern Italy, bear in some respects a striking resemblance to the rites of Adonis, and I have suggested that the Church may have consciously adapted the new festival to its heathen predecessor for the sake of winning souls to Christ. But this adaptation probably took place in the Greek-speaking rather than the Latin-speaking parts of the ancient world, for the worship of Adonis, while it flourished among the Greeks, appears to have made little impression on Rome and the West. Certainly, it never formed part of the official Roman religion. The place which it may have taken in the affections of the vulgar was already occupied by the similar but more barbarous worship of Attis and the Great Mother. Now the death and resurrection of Attis were officially celebrated at Rome on the 24th and 25th of March, the latter being regarded as the spring equinox, and therefore as the most appropriate day for the revival of a god of vegetation who had been dead or sleeping throughout the winter. But according to an ancient and widespread tradition, Christ suffered on the 25th of March, and accordingly some Christians regularly celebrated the crucifixion on that day without any regard to the state of the moon. This custom was certainly observed in Frisia, Cappadocia, and Gaul, and there seem to be grounds for thinking that at one time it was followed also in Rome. Thus the tradition, which placed the death of Christ on the 25th of March, was ancient and deeply rooted. It is all the more remarkable because astronomical considerations prove that it can have had no historical foundation. The inference appears to be inevitable that the Passion of Christ must have been arbitrarily referred to that date in order to harmonize with an older festival of the spring equinox. This is the view of the learned ecclesiastical historian, Magistrate Ducans, who points out that the death of the Savior was thus made to fall upon the very day on which, according to a widespread belief, the world had been created. But the resurrection of Attis, who combined in himself the characters of the Divine Father and the Divine Son, was officially celebrated at Rome on the same day. When we remember that the festival of St. George in April has replaced the ancient pagan festival of the Perilia, that the festival of St. John the Baptist in June was succeeded to a heathen midsummer festival of water, that the festival of the Assumption of the Virgin in August has ousted the festival of Diana, that the Feast of All Souls in November is a continuation of an old heathen feast of the dead, and that the nativity of Christ himself was assigned to the winter solstice in December because that day was deemed the nativity of the sun, we can hardly be thought rash or unreasonable in conjecturing that the other cardinal festival of the Christian Church, the solemnization of Easter, may have been in like manner and from like motives of edification adapted to a similar celebration of the Frisian god Attis at the vernal equinox. At least it is a remarkable coincidence, if it is nothing more, that the Christian and the heathen festivals of the divine death and resurrection should have been solemnized at the same season and in the same places. For the places which celebrated the death of Christ at the spring equinox were Frisia, Gaul, and apparently Rome. That is, the very regions in which the worship of Attis either originated or struck deepest root. It is difficult to regard the coincidence as purely accidental. If the vernal equinox, the season at which in the temperate regions the whole face of nature testifies to a fresh outburst of vital energy, had been viewed from of old as the time when the world was annually created afresh in the resurrection of God, nothing could be more natural than to place the resurrection of the new deity at the same cardinal point of the year. Only it is to be observed that if the death of Christ was dated on the 25th of March, this resurrection, according to Christian tradition, must have happened on the 27th of March, which is just 2 days later than the vernal equinox of the Julian calendar and the resurrection of Attis. A similar displacement of 2 days and the adjustment of Christian to heathen celebrations occurs in the festivals of St. George and the Assumption of the Virgin. However, another Christian tradition, followed by Lactantius, and perhaps by the practice of the Church in Gaul, placed the death of Christ on the 23rd and his resurrection on the 25th of March. If that was so, his resurrection coincided exactly with the resurrection of Attis. In point of fact, it appears from the testimony of an anonymous Christian who wrote in the 4th century of our era that Christians and pagans alike were struck by the remarkable coincidence between the death and resurrection of their respective deities, and that the coincidence formed a theme of bitter controversy between the adherents of the rival religions, the pagans contending that the resurrection of Christ was a spurious imitation of the resurrection of Attis, and the Christians asserting with equal warmth that the resurrection of Attis was a diabolical counterfeit of the resurrection of Christ. In these unseemly bickerings, the heathen took what to a superficial observer might seem strong ground by arguing that their God was the older and therefore presumably the original, not the counterfeit, since as a general rule, an original is older than its copy. This feeble argument the Christians easily rebutted. They admitted, indeed, that in point of time Christ was the junior deity, but they triumphantly demonstrated his real seniority by falling back on the subtlety of Satan, who on so important an occasion had surpassed himself by inverting the usual order of nature. Taken altogether, the coincidences of the Christian with the heathen festivals are too close and too numerous to be accidental. They mark the compromise which the Church, in the hour of its triumph, was compelled to make with its vanquished yet still dangerous rivals. The inflexible Protestantism of the primitive missionaries, with their fiery denunciations of heathendom, had been exchanged for the supple policy, the easy tolerance, the comprehensive charity of shrewd ecclesiastics, who clearly perceived that if Christianity was to conquer the world, it could do so only by relaxing the too rigid principles of its founder, by widening a little the narrow gate which leads to salvation. In this respect, an instructive parallel might be drawn between the history of Christianity and the history of Buddhism. Both systems were in their origin essentially ethical reforms born of the generous ardor, the lofty aspirations, the tender compassion of their noble founders, two of those beautiful spirits who appear at rare intervals on earth like beings come from a better world to support and guide our weak and erring nature. Both preached moral virtue as the means of accomplishing what they regarded as the supreme object of life, the eternal salvation of the individual soul. Though, by a curious antithesis, the one sought that salvation in a blissful eternity, the other in a final release from suffering and annihilation. But the austere ideals of sanctity which they inculcated were too deeply opposed not only to the frailties, but to the natural instincts of humanity ever to be carried out in practice by more than a small number of disciples, who consistently renounced the ties of the family and the state in order to work out their own salvation in the still seclusion of the cloister. If such faiths were to be nominally accepted by whole nations, or even by the world, it was essential that they should first be modified or transformed so as to accord in some measure with the prejudices, the passions, the superstitions of the vulgar. This process of accommodation was carried out in after ages by followers who, made of less ethereal stuff than their masters, were for that reason the better fitted to mediate between them and the common herd. Thus, as time went on, the two religions, in exact proportion to their growing popularity, absorbed more and more of those baser elements which they had been instituted for the very purpose of suppressing. Such spiritual decadences are inevitable. The world cannot live at the level of its great men, yet it would be unfair to the generality of our kind to ascribe wholly to their intellectual and moral weakness the gradual divergence of Buddhism and Christianity from their primitive patterns. For it should never be forgotten that by their glorification of poverty and celibacy, both these religions struck straight at the root, not merely of civil society, but of human existence. The blow was parried by the wisdom of the folly of the vast majority of mankind, who refused to purchase a chance of saving their souls with the certainty of extinguishing the species. Chapter 38. The Myth of Osiris. In ancient Egypt, the god whose death and resurrection were annually celebrated with alternate sorrow and joy was Osiris, the most popular of all Egyptian deities, and there are good grounds for classing him in one of his aspects with Adonis and Attis, as a personification of the great yearly vicissitudes of nature, especially of the corn. But the immense vogue, which he enjoyed for many ages, induced his devoted worshippers to heap upon him the attributes and powers of many other gods, so that it is not always easy to strip him, so to say, of his borrowed plumes, and to restore them to their proper owners. The story of Osiris is told in a connected form only by Plutarch, whose narrative has been confirmed, and to some extent amplified in modern times by the evidence of the monuments. Osiris was the offspring of an intrigue between the earth god, Seb, Keb or Geb, as the name is sometimes transliterated, and the sky goddess, Nut. The Greeks identified his parents with their own deities, Cronus and Rhea. When the sun god Ra perceived that his wife Nut had been unfaithful to him, he declared with a curse that she should be delivered of the child in no month and no year. But the goddess had another lover, the god Thoth, or Hermes, as the Greeks called him, and he, playing at draughts with the moon, won from her a 72nd part of every day, and having compounded 5 whole days out of these parts, he added them to the Egyptian year of 360 days. This was the mythical origin of the 5 supplementary days, which the Egyptians annually inserted at the end of every year in order to establish a harmony between lunar and solar time. On these 5 days, regarded as outside the year of 12 months, the curse of the sun god did not rest, and accordingly Osiris was born on the first of them. At his nativity, a voice rang out, proclaiming that the Lord of all had come into the world. Some say that a certain Pamiles heard a voice from the temple at Thebes bidding him announce with a shout that a great king, the beneficent Osiris, was born. But Osiris was not the only child of his mother. On the 2nd of the supplementary days, she gave birth to the elder Horus. On the 3rd, to the god Set, whom the Greeks called Typhon. On the 4th, to the goddess Isis. And on the 5th, to the goddess Nephthys. Afterwards, Set married his sister Nephthys, and Osiris married his sister Isis. Reigning as a king on earth, Osiris reclaimed the Egyptians from savagery, gave them laws, and taught them to worship the gods. Before his time, the Egyptians had been cannibals, but Isis, the sister and wife of Osiris, discovered wheat and barley growing wild, and Osiris introduced the cultivation of these grains amongst his people, who forthwith abandoned cannibalism and took kindly to a corn diet. Moreover, Osiris is said to have been the first to gather fruit from trees, to train the vine to poles, and to tread the grapes. Eager to communicate these beneficent discoveries to all mankind, he committed the whole government of Egypt to his wife Isis, and traveled over the world, diffusing the blessings of civilization and agriculture wherever he went. In countries where a harsh climate or bad soil forbade the cultivation of the vine, he taught the inhabitants to console themselves for the want of wine by brewing beer from barley. Loaded with the wealth that had been showered upon him by grateful nations, he returned to Egypt, and on account of the benefits he had conferred on mankind, he was unanimously hailed and worshipped as a deity. But his brother Set, whom the Greeks called Typhon, with 72 others plotted against him. Having taken the measure of his good brother's body by stealth, the bad brother Typhon fashioned and highly decorated a coffer of the same size, and once, when they were all drinking and making merry, he brought in the coffer and jestingly promised to give it to the one whom it should fit exactly. Well, they all tried, one after the other, but it fitted none of them. Last of all, Osiris stepped into it and lay down. On that, the conspirators ran and slammed the lid down on him, nailed it fast, soldered it with molten lead, and flung the coffer into the Nile. This happened on the 17th day of the month, Athir, when the sun is in the sign of the Scorpion, and in the 80 and 20th year of the reign or the life of Osiris. When Isis heard of it, she sheared off a lock of her hair, put on a mourning attire, and wandered disconsolately up and down, seeking the body. By the advice of the god of wisdom, she took refuge in the papyrus swamps of the delta. 7 scorpions accompanied her in her flight. One evening, when she was weary, she came to the house of a woman, who, alarmed at the sight of the scorpions, shut the door in her face. Then one of the scorpions crept under the door, and stung the child of the woman, that he died. But when Isis heard the mother's lamentation, her heart was touched, and she laid her hands on the child and uttered her powerful spells. So the poison was driven out of the child, and he lived. Afterwards, Isis herself gave birth to a son in the swamps. She had conceived him while she fluttered in the form of a hawk over the corpse of her dead husband. The infant was the younger Horus, who in his youth bore the name of Harpocrates, that is, the child Horus. Him, Buto, the goddess of the north, hid from the wrath of his wicked uncle Set. Yet she could not guard him from all mishap, for one day, when Isis came to her little son's hiding place, she found him stretched lifeless and rigid on the ground. A scorpion had stung him. Then Isis prayed to the sun god Ra for help. The god hearkened to her and stayed his bark in the sky, and sent down Thoth to teach her the spell by which she might restore her son to life. She uttered the words of power, and straightway the poison flowed from the body of Horus. Air passed into him, and he lived. Then Thoth ascended up into the sky, and took his place once more in the bark of the sun, and the bright pomp passed onward jubilant. Meantime, the coffer containing the body of Osiris had floated down the river and away out to sea, till at last it drifted ashore by Byblus, on the coast of Syria. Here a fine erica tree shot up suddenly and enclosed the chest in its trunk. The king of the country, admiring the growth of the tree, had it cut down and made into a pillar of his house. But he did not know that the coffer with the dead Osiris was in it. Word of this came to Isis, and she journeyed to Byblus, and sat down by the well in humble guise, her face wet with tears. To none would she speak, till the king's handmaidens came. And them she greeted kindly, and braided their hair, and breathed on them from her own divine body a wondrous perfume. But when the queen beheld the braids of her handmaiden's hair, and smelt the sweet smell that emanated from them, she sent for the stranger woman, and took her into her house, and made her the nurse of her child. But Isis gave the babe her finger instead of her breast to suck, and at night she began to burn all that was mortal of him away, while she herself, in the likeness of a swallow, fluttered round the pillar that contained her dead brother, twittering mournfully. But the queen spied what she was doing, and shrieked out when she saw her child in flames, and thereby she hindered him from becoming immortal. The goddess revealed herself, and begged for the pillar of the roof, and they gave it her, and she cut the coffer out of it, and fell upon it, and embraced it, and lamented so loud that the younger of the king's children died of fright on the spot. But the trunk of the tree she wrapped in fine linen, and poured ointment on it, and gave it to the king and queen. And the wood stands in a temple of Isis, and is worshipped by the people of Byblus to this day. And Isis put the coffer in a boat, and took the eldest of the king's children with her, and sailed away. As soon as they were alone, she opened the chest, and laying her face on the face of her brother, she kissed him and wept. But the child came behind her softly, and saw what she was about. And she turned and looked at him in anger, and the child could not bear her look, and died. But some say that it was not so, but that he fell into the sea, and was drowned. It is he whom the Egyptians sing of at their banquets, under the name of Maneros. But Isis put the coffer by, and went to see her son Horus at the city of Buto. And Typhon found the coffer as he was hunting a boar one night by the light of a full moon. And he knew the body, and rent it into 14 pieces, and scattered them abroad. But Isis sailed up and down the marshes in a shallop made of papyrus, looking for the pieces. And that is why, when people sail in shallops made of papyrus, the crocodiles do not hurt them, for they fear or respect the goddess. And that is the reason, too, why there are many graves of Osiris in Egypt, for she buried each limb as she found it. But others will have it that she buried an image of him in every city, pretending it was his body, in order that Osiris might be worshipped in many places, and that if Typhon searched for the real grave, he might not be able to find it. However, the genital member of Osiris had been eaten by the fishes, so Isis made an image of it instead, and the image is used by the Egyptians at their festivals to this day. Isis, writes the historian Diodorus Siculus, recovered all the parts of the body except the genitals, and because she wished that her husband's grave should be unknown and honored by all who dwell in the land of Egypt, she resorted to the following device. She molded human images out of wax and spices, corresponding to the stature of Osiris, round each one of the parts of his body. Then she called to the priests according to their families, and took an oath of them all that they would reveal to no man the trust she was about to repose in them. So, to each of them privately, she said that to them alone she entrusted the burial of the body, and reminding them of the benefits they had received, she exhorted them to bury the body in their own land, and to honor Osiris as a god. She also besought them to dedicate one of the animals of their country, whichever they chose, and to honor it in life as they had formerly honored Osiris, and when it died to grant it obsequies like his. And because she would encourage the priests in their own interest to bestow the aforesaid honors, she gave them a third part of the land to be used by them in the service and worship of the gods. Accordingly, it is said that the priests, mindful of the benefits of Osiris, desirous of gratifying the queen, and moved by the prospect of gain, carried out all the injunctions of Isis. Wherefore, to this day, each of the priests imagines that Osiris is buried in his country, and they honor the beasts that were consecrated in the beginning. And when the animals die, the priests renew at their burial the mourning for Osiris. But the sacred bulls, the one called Apis and the other Nevis, were dedicated to Osiris, and it was ordained that they should be worshipped as gods in common by all the Egyptians, since these animals, above all others, had helped the discoveries of corn in sowing the seed, and procuring the universal benefits of agriculture. Such is the myth or legend of Osiris, as told by Greek writers, and eked out by more or less fragmentary notices or allusions in native Egyptian literature. A long inscription in the Temple of Dendra has preserved a list of the god's graves, and other texts mention the parts of his body which were treasured as holy relics in each of the sanctuaries. Thus, his heart was at Athribis, his backbone at Busiris, his neck at Letopolis, and his head at Memphis. As often happens in such cases, some of his divine limbs were miraculously multiplied. His head, for example, was at Abydos as well as at Memphis, and his legs, which were remarkably incredibly numerous, would have sufficed for several ordinary mortals. In this respect, however, Osiris was nothing at St. Denis, of whom no less than 7 heads, all equally genuine, are extant. According to native Egyptian accounts, which supplement that of Plutarch, when Isis had found the corpse of her husband Osiris, she and her sister Nephthys sat down beside it and uttered a lament, which in after ages became the type of all Egyptian lamentations for the dead. "Come to thy house," they wailed. "Come to thy house, O God On! Come to thy house. Thou who hast no foes, O fair youth, come to thy house, that thou mayest see me. I am thy sister, whom thou lovest. Thou shalt not part from me. O fair boy, come to thy house. I see thee not, yet doth my heart yearn after thee, and mine eyes desire thee. Come to her who loves thee, who loves thee. Unefer, thou blessed one, come to thy sister, come to thy wife, thou whose heart stands still, come to thy housewife, I am thy sister, by the same mother, thou shalt not be far from me, gods and men have turned their faces towards thee, and weep for thee together. I call after thee and weep, so that my cry is heard to heaven, but thou hearest not my voice, yet am I thy sister, whom thou didst love on earth. Thou didst love none but me, my brother, my brother. This lament for the fair youth cut off in his prime reminds us of the laments for Adonis. The title of Unefer, or the good being, bestowed on him marks the beneficence which tradition universally ascribed to Osiris. It was at once his commonest title and one of his names as king. The lamentations of the 2 sad sisters were not in vain. In pity for her sorrow, the sun god Ra sent down from heaven the jackal-headed god Anubis, who, with the aid of Isis and Nephthys, of Thoth and Horus, pieced together the broken body of the murdered god, swathed it in linen bandages, and observed all the other rites which the Egyptians were wont to perform over the bodies of the departed. Then Isis fanned the cold clay with her wings. Osiris revived, and thenceforth reigned as king over the dead in the other world. There he bore the titles of Lord of the Underworld, Lord of Eternity, Ruler of the Dead. There, too, in the great hall of the 2 Truths, assisted by 42 assessors, one from each of the principal districts of Egypt, he presided as judge at the trial of the souls of the departed, who made their solemn confession before him, and their heart having been weighed in the balance of justice, received the reward of virtue in a life eternal, or the appropriate punishment of their sins. In the resurrection of Osiris, the Egyptians saw the pledge of a life everlasting for themselves beyond the grave. They believed that every man would live eternally in the other world if only his surviving friends did for his body what the gods had done for the body of Osiris. Hence, the ceremonies observed by the Egyptians over the human dead were an exact copy of those which Anubis, Horus, and the rest had performed over the dead god. At every burial there was enacted a representation of the divine mystery which had been performed of old over Osiris, when his son, his sisters, his friends were gathered round his mangled remains and succeeded by their spells and manipulations in converting his broken body into the first mummy, which they afterwards reanimated and furnished with the means of entering on a new individual life beyond the grave. The mummy of the deceased was Osiris. The professional female mourners were his 2 sisters, Isis and Nephthys. Anubis, Horus, all the gods of the Syrian legend gathered about the corpse. In this way, every dead Egyptian was identified with Osiris and bore his name. From the Middle Kingdom onwards, it was the regular practice to address the deceased as Osiris so-and-so, as if they were the god himself, and to add the standing epithet true of speech, because true speech was characteristic of Osiris. The thousands of inscribed and pictured tombs that have been opened in the valley of the Nile prove that the mystery of the resurrection was performed for the benefit of every dead Egyptian. As Osiris died and rose again from the dead, so all men hoped to arise like him from death to life eternal. Thus, according to what seems to have been the general native tradition, Osiris was a good and beloved king of Egypt, who suffered a violent death, but rose from the dead, and was henceforth worshipped as a deity. In harmony with this tradition, he was regularly represented by sculptors and painters in human and regal form as a dead king, swathed in the wrappings of a mummy, but wearing on his head a kingly crown, and grasping in one of his hands, which were left free from the bandages, a kingly scepter. 2 cities above all others were associated with this myth or memory. One of them was Busiris in Lower Egypt, who claimed to possess the backbone. The other was Abydos in Upper Egypt, which glorified in the possession of his head. Encircled by the nimbus of the dead yet living god, Abydos, originally an obscure place, became from the end of the Old Kingdom the holiest spot in Egypt. His tomb there would seem to have been to the Egyptians what the Church of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem is to Christians. It was the wish of every pious man that his dead body should rest in hallowed earth near the grave of the glorified Osiris. Few indeed were rich enough to enjoy this inestimable privilege, for, apart from the cost of a tomb in the sacred city, the mere transport of mummies from great distances was both difficult and expensive. Yet so eager were many to absorb in death the blessed influence which radiated from the Holy Sepulchre, that they caused their surviving friends to convey their mortal remains to Abydos, where to tarry for a short time, and then to be brought back by river and interred in the tombs which had been made ready for them in their native land. Others had cenotaphs built or memorial tablets erected for themselves near the tomb of their dead and risen Lord, that they might share with him the bliss of a joyful resurrection. Chapter 39. The Ritual of Osiris. Subsection 1. The Popular Rites. A useful clue to the original nature of a god or goddess is often furnished by the season at which his or her festival is celebrated. Thus, if the festival falls at the new or the full moon, there is a certain presumption that the deity thus honored either is the moon or at least has lunar affinities. If the festival is held at the winter or summer solstice, we naturally surmise that the god is the sun, or at all events that he stands in some close relation to that luminary. Again, if the festival coincides with the time of sowing or harvest, we are inclined to infer that the divinity is an embodiment of the earth or of the corn. These presumptions or inferences, taken by themselves, are by no means conclusive, but if they happen to be confirmed by other indications, the evidence may be regarded as fairly strong. Unfortunately, in dealing with the Egyptian gods, we are in a great measure precluded from making use of this clue. The reason is not that the dates of the festivals are always unknown, but that they shifted from year to year, until after a long interval they had revolved around the whole course of the seasons. This gradual revolution of the festal Egyptian cycle resulted from the employment of a calendar year, which neither corresponded exactly to the solar year, nor was periodically corrected by intercalation. If the Egyptian farmer of the olden time could get no help, except at the rarest intervals, from the official or sacerdotal calendar, he must have been compelled to observe for himself those natural signals which marked the times for the various operations of husbandry. In all ages of which we possess any records, the Egyptians have been an agricultural people, dependent for their subsistence on the growth of the corn. The cereals which they cultivated were wheat, barley, and apparently sorghum, Holcus sorghum lineus, the doura of the modern fellahin. Then, as now, the whole country, with the exception of a fringe on the coast of the Mediterranean, was almost rainless, and owed its immense fertility entirely to the annual inundation of the Nile, which, regulated by an elaborate system of dams and canals, was distributed over the fields, renewing the soil year by year with a fresh deposit of mud, washed down from the great equatorial lakes and the mountains of Abyssinia. Hence the rise of the river has always been watched by the inhabitants with the utmost anxiety, for if it either falls short of or exceeds a certain height, dearth and famine are the inevitable consequences. The water begins to rise early in June, but it is not until the latter half of July that it swells to a mighty tide. By the end of September, the inundation is at its greatest height. The country is now submerged and presents the appearance of a sea of turbid water, from which the towns and villages, built on higher ground, rise like islands. For about a month the flood remains nearly stationary, then sinks more and more rapidly, till by December or January the river has returned to its ordinary bed. With the approach of summer, the level of the water continues to fall. In the early days of June, the Nile is reduced to half its ordinary breadth, and Egypt, scorched by the sun, blasted by the wind that has blown from the Sahara for many days, seems a mere continuation of the desert. The trees are choked with a thick layer of gray dust. A few meager patches of vegetables, watered with difficulty, struggle painfully for existence in the immediate neighborhood of the villages. Some appearance of verdure lingers beside the canals and in the hollows from which the moisture has not wholly evaporated. celebrated. The plain appears to paint in the pitiless sunshine, bare, dusty, ash-colored, cracked and seamed as far as the eye can see, with a network of fissures. From the middle of April till the middle of June, the land of Egypt is but half alive, waiting for the new Nile. For countless ages, this cycle of natural events has determined the annual labors of the Egyptian husbandman. The first work of the agricultural year is the cutting of the dams which have hitherto prevented the swollen river from flooding the canals and the fields. This is done, and the pent-up waters released on their beneficent mission, in the first half of August. In November, when the inundation has subsided, wheat, barley, and sorghum are sown. The time of harvest varies with the district, falling about a month later in the north than in the south. In Upper or Southern Egypt, barley is reaped at the beginning of March, wheat at the beginning of April, and sorghum about the end of that month. It is natural to suppose that the various events of the agricultural year were celebrated by the Egyptian farmer with some simple religious rites designed to secure the blessing of the gods upon his labors. These rustic ceremonies he would continue to perform year after year at the same season, while the solemn festivals of the priests continued to shift with the shifting calendar, from summer through spring to winter, and so backward through autumn to summer. The rites of the husbandman were stable because they rested on direct observation of nature. The rites of the priest were unstable because they were based on a false calculation. Yet many of the priestly festivals may have been nothing but the old rural festivals disguised in the course of ages by the pomp of sacerdotalism and severed by the error of the calendar from their roots in the natural cycle of the seasons. These conjectures are confirmed by the little we know both of the popular and of the official Egyptian religion. Thus, we are told that the Egyptians held a festival of Isis at the time when the Nile began to rise. They believed that the goddess was then mourning for the lost Osiris, and that the tears which dropped from her eyes swelled the impetuous tide of the river. Now, if Osiris was in one of his aspects a god of the corn, nothing could be more natural than that he should be mourned at midsummer. For by the time the harvest was past, the fields were bare, the river ran low, life seemed to be suspended, the corn god was dead. At such a moment, people who saw the handiwork of divine beings in all the operations of nature might well trace the swelling of the sacred stream to the tears shed by the goddess at the death of the beneficent corn god, her husband. And the sign of the rising waters on the earth was accompanied by a sign in heaven, for in the early days of Egyptian history, some 3,000 or 4,000 years before the beginning of our era, the splendid star of Sirius, the brightest of all the fixed stars, appeared at dawn in the east, just before sunrise, about the time of the summer solstice, when the Nile begins to rise. The Egyptians called it Sothis, and regarded it as the star of Isis, just as the Babylonians deemed the planet Venus the star of Astarte. To both peoples, apparently, the brilliant luminary in the morning sky seemed the goddess of life and love come to mourn her departed lover or spouse, and to wake him from the dead. Hence, the rising of Sirius marked the beginning of the sacred Egyptian year, and was regularly celebrated by a festival which did not shift with the shifting official year. The cutting of the dams and the admission of the water into the canals and fields is a great event in the Egyptian year. At Cairo, the operation generally takes place between the 6th and 17th of August, until lately was attended by ceremonies which deserve to be noticed, because they were probably handed down from antiquity. An ancient canal, known by the name of the Kali, formerly passed through the native town of Cairo. Near its entrance, the canal was crossed by a dam of earth, very broad at the bottom and diminishing in breadth upwards, which used to be constructed before or soon after the Nile began to rise. In front of the dam, on the other side of the river, was reared a truncated cone of earth called the aruse, or bride, on the top of which a little maize or millet was generally sown. This bride was commonly washed down by the rising tide a week or a fortnight before the cutting of the dam. Tradition runs that the old custom was to deck a young virgin in gay apparel and throw her into the river as a sacrifice to obtain a plentiful inundation. Whether that was so or not, the intention of the practice appears to have been to marry the river, conceived as a male power, to his bride, the cornland, which was so soon to be fertilized by his water. The ceremony was therefore a charm to ensure the growth of the crops. In modern times, money used to be thrown into the canal on this occasion, and the populace dived into the water after it. This practice also would seem to have been ancient, For Seneca tells us that at a place called the Veins of the Nile, not far from Philae, the priests used to cast money and offerings of gold into the river at a festival which apparently took place at the rising of the water. The next great operation of the agricultural year in Egypt is the sowing of the seed in November, when the water of the inundation has retreated from the fields. With the Egyptians, as with many peoples of antiquity, the committing of the seed to the earth assumed the character of a solemn and mournful rite. On this subject, I will let Plutarch speak for himself. What, he asks, are we to make of the gloomy, joyless, and mournful sacrifices, if it is wrong either to omit the established rites or to confuse and disturb our conceptions of the gods by absurd suspicions? For the Greeks also perform many rites which resemble those of Egyptians and are observed about the same time. Thus, at the festival of the Thesmophoria in Athens, women sit on the ground and fast, and the Boeotians open the vaults of the Sorrowful One, naming that festival sorrowful because Demeter is sorrowing for the descent of the maiden. The month is the month of sowing, about the setting of the Pleiades. The Egyptians call it Aether, and the Athenians Paenepsion, the Boeotians the month of Demeter. For it was the time of the year when they saw some of the fruits vanishing and failing from the trees, while they sowed others grudgingly and with difficulty, scraping the earth with their hands and huddling it up again on the uncertain chance that what they deposited in the ground would ever ripen and come to maturity. Thus, they did in many respects like those who bury and mourn their dead. The Egyptian harvest, as we have seen, falls not in autumn, but in spring, in the months of March, April, and May. To the husbandman, the time of harvest, at least in a good year, must necessarily be a season of joy. In bringing home his sheaves, he is requited for his long and anxious labors. Yet, if the old Egyptian farmer felt a secret joy at reaping and garnering the grain, it was essential that he should conceal the natural emotion under an air of profound dejection. For was he not severing the body of the corn god with his sickle and trampling it to pieces under the hooves of his cattle on the threshing floor? Accordingly, we are told that it was an ancient custom of the Egyptian corn reapers to beat their breasts and lament over the first sheaf cut, while at the same time they called upon Isis. The invocation seems to have taken the form of a melancholy chant, to which the Greeks gave the name Mineros. Similar plaintive strains were chanted by corn reapers in Phoenicia and other parts of Western Asia. Probably all these doleful ditties were lamentations for the corn god killed by the sickles of the reapers. In Egypt, the slain deity was Osiris, and the name Mineros, applied to the dirge, appears to be derived from certain words meaning "come to thy house," which often occur in the lamentations for the dead god. Ceremonies of the same sort have been observed by other peoples, probably for the same purpose. Thus we are told that among all vegetables, corn, by which is apparently meant maize, holds the first place in the household economy and the ceremonial observance of the Cherokee Indians, who invoke it under the name of the Old Woman, in allusion to a myth that it sprang from the blood of an old woman killed by her disobedient sons. After the last working of the crop, a priest and his assistant went into the field and sang songs of invocation to the spirit of the corn. After that, a loud rustling would be heard, which was thought to be caused by the old woman bringing the corn into the field. A clean trail was always kept from the field to the house, so that the corn might be encouraged to stay at home and not go wandering elsewhere. Another curious ceremony, of which even the memory is now almost forgotten, was enacted after the first working of the corn, when the owner or priest stood in succession at each of the four corners of the field and wept and wailed loudly. Even the priests are now unable to give a season for this performance, which may have been a lament for the bloody death of Selu, the old woman of the corn. In these Cherokee practices, the lamentations and the invocations of the old woman of the corn resemble the ancient Egyptian customs of lamenting over the first corn cut and calling upon Isis, herself probably, in one of her aspects, an old woman of the corn. Further, the Cherokee precaution of leaving a clear path from the field to the house resembles the Egyptian invitation to Osiris, "Come to thy house." So, in the East Indies, to this day, people observe elaborate ceremonies for the purpose of bringing back the soul of the rice from the fields to the barn. The Nandi of East Africa perform a ceremony in September when the Eleusine grain is ripening. Every woman who owns a plantation goes out with her daughters into the cornfields and makes a bonfire of the branches and leaves of certain trees. After they pluck some of the Eleusine, and each of them puts one grain in her necklace, chews another, and rubs it on her forehead, throat, and breast. No joy is shown by the womenfolk on this occasion, and they sorrowfully cut a basketful of the corn, which they take home with them and place in the loft to dry. The conception of the corn spirit as old and dead at harvest is very clearly embodied in a custom observed by the Arabs of Moab. When the harvesters have nearly finished their task and only a small corner of the field remains to be reaped, the owner takes a handful of wheat tied up in a sheaf. A hole is dug in the form of a grave, and 2 stones are set upright, one at the head and the other at the foot, just as in an ordinary burial. Then the sheaf of wheat is laid at the bottom of the grave, and the sheik pronounces these words, "The old man is dead." Earth is afterwards thrown in to cover the sheaf with a prayer, "May Allah bring us back the wheat of the dead." Subsection 2. The official rites. Such, then, were the principal events of the farmer's calendar in ancient Egypt, and such the simple religious rites by which he celebrated them. But we have still to consider the Osirian festivals of the official calendar, so far as these are described by Greek writers or recorded on the monuments. In examining them, it is necessary to bear in mind that on account of the movable year of the old Egyptian calendar, the true or astronomical dates of the official festivals must have varied from year to year, at least until the adoption of the fixed Alexandrian year in 30 BC. From that time onward, apparently, the dates of the festivals were determined by the new calendar, and so ceased to rotate throughout the length of the solar year. At all events, Plutarch, writing about the end of the 1st century, implies that they were then fixed, not movable, for though he does not mention the Alexandrian calendar, he clearly dates the festivals by it. Moreover, the long festal calendar of Esne, an important document of the imperial age, is obviously based on the fixed Alexandrian year, for it assigns the mark for New Year's Day to the day which corresponds to the 29th of August, which was the first day of the Alexandrian year, and its references to the rising of the Nile, the position of the sun, and the operations of agriculture are all in harmony with this supposition. Thus, we may take it as fairly certain that from 30 BC onwards, the Egyptian festivals were stationary in the solar year. Herodotus tells us that the grave of Osiris was at Sais in Lower Egypt, and that there was a lake there upon which the sufferings of the god were displayed as a mystery by night. This commemoration of the divine passion was held once a year. The people mourned and beat their breasts at it to testify their sorrow for the death of the god, and an image of the cow, made of gilt wood with a golden sun between its horns, was carried out of the chamber in which it stood the rest of the year. The cow no doubt represented Isis herself, for cows were sacred to her, and she was regularly depicted with the horns of a cow on her head, or even as a woman with the head of a cow. It is probable that the carrying out of her cow-shaped image symbolized the goddess searching for the dead body of Osiris, for this was the native Egyptian interpretation of a similar ceremony observed in Plutarch's time, about the winter solstice, when the gilt cow was carried 7 times round the temple. A great feature of the festival was the nocturnal illumination. People fastened rows of oil lamps to the outside of their houses, and the lamps burned all night long. The custom was not confined to Sais, but was observed throughout the whole of Egypt. This universal illumination of the houses on one night of the year suggests that the festival may have been a commemoration not only of the dead Osiris, but the dead in general. In other words, that it may have been a night of all souls. For it is a widespread belief that the souls of the dead revisit their old homes on one night of the year, and on that solemn occasion people prepare for the reception of the ghosts by laying out food for them to eat and lighting lamps to guide them on their dark road from and to the grave. Herodotus, who briefly describes the festival, omits to mention its date, but we can determine it with some probability from other sources. Thus, Plutarch tells us that Osiris was murdered on the 17th of the month, Athir, and that the Egyptians accordingly observed mournful rites for 4 days from the 17th of Athir. Now, in the Alexandrian calendar, which Plutarch used, these 4 days correspond to the 13th, 14th, and 15th, and 16th of November, and this date answers exactly to the other indications given by Plutarch, who says that at the time of the festival the Nile was sinking, the north winds dying away, the nights lengthening, and the leaves falling from the trees. During these 4 days a gilt cow swathed in a black pall was exhibited as an image of Isis. This, no doubt, was the image mentioned by Herodotus in his account of the festival. On the 19th day of the month, the people went down to the sea, the priests carrying a shrine which contained a golden casket. Into this casket they poured fresh water, and thereupon the spectators raised a shout that Osiris was found. After that, they took some vegetable mold, moistened it with water, mixed it with precious spices and incense, and molded the paste into a small moon-shaped image, which was then robed and ornamented. Thus, it appears that the purpose of the ceremonies described by Plutarch was to represent dramatically, first, the search for the dead body of Osiris, and second, its joyful discovery, followed by the resurrection of the dead god who came to life again in the new image of vegetable mold and spices. Lactantius tells us how on these occasions the priests, with their shaven bodies, beat their breasts and lamented, imitating the sorrowful search of Isis for her lost son Osiris, and how afterwards their sorrow was turned to joy when the jackal-headed god Anubis, or rather a mummer in his stead, produced a small boy, the living representative of the god who was lost and was found. Thus Lactantius regarded Osiris as the son instead of the husband of Isis, and he makes no mention of the image of vegetable mold. It is probable that the boy who figured in the sacred drama played the part not of Osiris, but of his son Horus. But as the death and resurrection of the god were celebrated in many cities of Egypt, it is also possible that in some places the part of the god come to life was played by a living actor instead of an image. Another Christian writer describes how the Egyptians, with shorn heads, annually lamented over a burial idol of Osiris, smiting their breasts, slashing their shoulders, ripping open their old wounds, until after several days of mourning they professed to find the mangled remains of the god, at which they rejoiced. However, the details of the ceremony may have varied in different places. The pretense of finding the god's body, and probably of restoring it to life, was a great event in the festal year of the Egyptians. The shouts of joy which greeted it are described or alluded to by many ancient writers. The funeral rites of Osiris, as they were observed at this great festival in the 16 provinces of Egypt, are described in a long inscription of the Ptolemaic period, which is engraved on the walls of the god's temple at Dendera, the Tentyra of the Greeks, a town of Upper Egypt, situated on the western bank of the Nile, about 40 miles north of Thebes. Unfortunately, while the information thus furnished is remarkably full and minute on many points, the arrangement adopted in the inscription is so confused and the expression often so obscure that a clear and consistent account of the ceremonies as a whole can hardly be extracted from it. Moreover, we learn that the ceremonies varied somewhat in the several cities, the ritual of Abydos, for example, differing from that of Busiris. Without attempting to trace all the particularities of local usage, I shall briefly indicate what seem to have been the leading features of the festival, so far as these can be ascertained with tolerable certainty. The rites lasted 18 days, from the 12th to the 30th of the month Khoiak, and set forth the nature of Osiris in his triple aspect as dead, dismembered, and finally reconstituted by the union of his scattered limbs. In the first of these aspects he was called Shentemet, Kenti Amenti, in the second Osiris Sep, and in the third Sokari, Seeker. Small images of the god were molded of sand or vegetable earth and corn, to which incense was sometimes added. His face was painted yellow and his cheekbones green. These images were cast in a mold of pure gold, which represented the god in the form of a mummy, with the white crown of Egypt on his head. The festival opened on the 12th day of Khoiak, and a ceremony of plowing and sowing. 2 black cows were yoked to the plow, which was made of tamarisk wood, while the share was a black copper. A boy scattered the seed. One end of the field was sown with barley, the other with spelt, and the middle with flax. During the operation, the chief celebrant recited the ritual chapter of the sowing of the fields. At Busiris, on the 20th of Khoiak, sand and barley were put in the god's garden, which appears to have been a sort of large flower pot. This was done in the presence of the cow goddess Shenti, represented seemingly by the image of a cow made of gilt sycamore wood, with a headless human image in its inside. Then fresh inundation water was poured out of a golden vase over both the goddess and the garden, and the barley was allowed to grow as the emblem of the resurrection of the god after his burial in the earth, for the growth of the garden is the growth of the divine substance. On the 22nd of Koyak, at the 8th hour, the images of Osiris, attended by 34 images of deities, performed a mysterious voyage in 34 tiny boats made of papyrus, which were illuminated by 365 lights. On the 24th of Koyak, after sunset, the effigy of Osiris in a coffin of mulberry wood was laid in the grave. And at the 9th hour of the night, the effigy, which had been made and deposited the year before, was removed and placed upon boughs of sycamore. Lastly, on the 30th day of Koyak, they repaired to the Holy Sepulchre, a subterranean chamber over which appears to have grown a clump of Persea trees. Entering the vault by the western door, they laid the coffin effigy of the dead god reverently on a bed of sand in the chamber. So they left him to his rest, and departed from the sepulchre by the eastern door. Thus ended the ceremonies in the month of Koyak. In the foregoing account of the festival, drawn from the great inscription of Dendera, the burial of Osiris figures prominently, while his resurrection is implied rather than expressed. This defect of the document, however, is amply compensated by a remarkable series of bas-reliefs which accompany and illustrate the inscription. These exhibit in a series of scenes the dead god lying swathed as a mummy on his bier, then gradually raising himself up higher and higher until at last he was entirely quitted the bier and is seen erect between the guardian wings of the faithful Isis, who stands behind him, while a male figure holds up before his eyes the crux ansata, the Egyptian symbol of life. The resurrection of the god could hardly be portrayed more graphically. Even more instructive, however, is another representation of the same event in a chamber dedicated to Osiris in the great temple of Isis at Philae. Here we see the dead body of Osiris, with stalks of corn springing from it, while a priest waters the stalks from a pitcher which he holds in his hand. The accompanying inscription sets forth that this is the form of him whom one may not name, Osiris of the mysteries, who springs from the returning waters. Taken together, the picture and the words seem to leave no doubt that Osiris was here conceived and represented as a personification of the corn which springs from the fields after they have been fertilized by the inundation. This, according to the inscription, was the kernel of the mysteries, the innermost secret revealed to the initiated. So, in the rites of Demeter at Eleusis, a reaped ear of corn was exhibited to the worshippers as the central mystery of their religion. We can now fully understand why at the great festival of sowing in the month of Koyak, the priests used to bury effigies of Osiris made of earth and corn. When these effigies were taken up again at the end of the year, or of a shorter interval, the corn would be found to have sprouted from the body of Osiris, and the sprouting of the corn would be hailed as an omen, or rather as the cause of the growth of the crops. The corn god produced the corn from himself. He gave his own body to feed the people. He died that they might live. And from the death and resurrection of their great god, the Egyptians drew not only their support and sustenance in this life, but also their hope of a life eternal beyond the grave. This hope is indicated in the clearest manner by the very remarkable effigies of Osiris, which have come to light in Egyptian cemeteries. Thus, in the Valley of the Kings at Thebes, there was found the tomb of a royal fan-bearer who lived about 1500 BC. Among the rich contents of the tomb, there was a bier on which rested a mattress of reeds, covered with 3 layers of linen. On the upper side of the linen was painted a life-size figure of Osiris, and the interior of the figure, which was waterproof, contained a mixture of vegetable mold, barley, and a sticky fluid. The barley had sprouted and sent out shoots 2 or 3 inches long. Again, in the cemetery at Sinopolis were numerous burials of Osiris figures. These were made of grain wrapped up in cloth and roughly shaped like an Osiris, and placed inside a bricked-up recess at the side of the tomb, sometimes in small pottery coffins, sometimes in wooden coffins in the form of a hawk mummy, sometimes without any coffins at all. These corn-stuffed figures were bandaged like mummies, with patches of gilding here and there, as if an imitation of the golden mold in which the similar figures of Osiris were cast at the festival of sowing. Again, effigies of Osiris, with faces of green wax and their interior full of grain, were found buried near the necropolis of Thebes. Finally, we are told by Professor Erman that between the legs of mummies there sometimes lies a figure of Osiris made of slime. It is filled with grains of corn. the sprouting of which is intended to signify the resurrection of the god. We cannot doubt that, just as the burial of corn-stuffed images of Osiris in the earth at the festival of sowing was designed to quicken the seed, so the burial of similar images in the grave was meant to quicken the dead, in other words, to ensure their spiritual immortality. Chapter 40. The Nature of Osiris. Subsection 1. Osiris, a corn god. The foregoing survey of the myth and ritual of Osiris may suffice to prove that in one of his aspects the god was a personification of the corn, which may be said to die and come to life again every year, though all the pomp and glamour with which in later times the priests had invested his worship, the conception of him as the corn god comes clearly out in the festival of his death and resurrection, which was celebrated in the month of Koyak, and at a later period in the month of Athir. That festival appears to have been essentially a festival of sowing, which properly fell at the time when the husbandman actually committed the seed to the earth. On the occasion, an effigy of the corn god, molded of earth and corn, was buried with funeral rites in the ground in order that, dying there, he might come to life again with new crops. The ceremony was, in fact, a charm to ensure the growth of the corn by sympathetic magic, and we may conjecture that as such it was practiced in a simple form by every Egyptian farmer on his fields long before it was adopted and transfigured by the priests in the stately ritual of the temple. In the modern, but doubtless ancient Arab custom of burying the old man, namely a sheaf of wheat in the harvest field, and praying that he may return from the dead, we see the germ out of which the worship of the corn god Osiris was probably developed. The details of his myth fit in well with the interpretation of the god. He was said to be the offspring of sky and earth. What more appropriate parentage could be invented for the corn which springs from the ground that has been fertilized by the water of heaven? It is true that the land of Egypt owed its fertility directly to the Nile, and not to showers, but the inhabitants must have known or guessed that the great river, in its turn, was fed by the rains which fell in the far interior. Again, the legend that Osiris was the first to teach men the use of corn would be most naturally told of the corn god himself. Further, the story that his mangled remains were scattered up and down the land and buried in different places may be a mythical way of expressing either the sowing or the winnowing of the grain. The latter interpretation is supported by the tale that Isis placed the severed limbs of Osiris on a corn sieve, or more probably, the legend may be a reminiscence of a custom of slaying a human victim, perhaps the representative of the corn spirit, and distributing his flesh or scattering his ashes over the fields to fertilize them. In modern Europe, the figure of death is sometimes torn in pieces, and the fragments are then buried in the ground to make the crops grow well, and in other parts of the world, human victims are treated in the same way. With regard to the ancient Egyptians, we have it on the authority of Manetho that they used to burn red-haired men and scatter their ashes with winnowing fans, and it is highly significant that this barbarous sacrifice was offered by the kings at the grave of Osiris. We may conjecture that the victims represented Osiris himself, who was annually slain, dismembered, and buried in their persons that he might quicken the seed in the earth. Possibly in prehistoric times, the kings themselves played the part of the god and were slain and dismembered in that character. Set as well as Osiris is said to have been torn in pieces after a reign of 18 days, which was commemorated by an annual festival of the same length. According to one story, Romulus, the first king of Rome, was cut in pieces by the senators who buried the fragments of him in the ground, and the traditional day of his death, the 17th of July, was celebrated with certain curious rites, which were apparently connected with the artificial fertilization of the fig. Again, Greek legend told how Pentheus, king of Thebes, and Lycurgus, king of the Thracian Edonians, opposed the vine god Dionysus, and how the impious monarchs were rent in pieces, the one by the frenzied bacchanals, the other by horses. The Greek traditions may well be distorted reminiscences of a custom of sacrificing human beings, and especially divine kings, in the character of Dionysus, a god who resembled Osiris in many points, and was said like him to have been torn limb from limb, him. We have been told that in Chios, men were rent in pieces as a sacrifice to Dionysus, and since they died the same death as their god, it is reasonable to suppose that they personated him. The story that the Thracian Orpheus was similarly torn limb from limb by the Bacchanals seems to indicate that he too perished in the character of the god whose death he died. It is significant that the Thracian Lycurgus, king of the Edonians, is said to have been put to death in order that the ground, which had ceased to be fruitful, might regain its fertility. Further, we read of a Norwegian king, Halfdan the Black, whose body was cut up and buried in different parts of his kingdom for the sake of ensuring the fruitfulness of the earth. He is said to have been drowned at the age of 40 through the breaking of the ice in spring. What followed his death is thus related by the Old Norse historian Snorri Sturluson. He had been the most prosperous, literally blessed with abundance, of all kings. So greatly did men value him that when the news came that he was dead and his body removed to Hringriki and intended for burial there, the chief men from Raumariki and Westfold and Heithmork came and all requested that they might take his body with them and bury it in their various provinces. They thought that it would bring abundance to those who obtained it. Eventually, it was settled that the body was distributed in 4 places. The head was laid in a barrow in Stein, in Hringriki, and each party took away their own share and buried it. All these barrows are called Halfdan's barrows. It should be remembered that this Halfdan belonged to the family of the Ynglinks, who traced their descent from Frey, the great Scandinavian god of fertility. The natives of Kovai, an island lying off the mouth of the Fly River in British New Guinea, tell of a certain magician named Sagara, who had Sago for his totem. When Sagara was old and ill, he told the people that he would soon die, but that nevertheless he would cause their gardens to thrive. Accordingly, he instructed them that when he was dead, they should cut him up and place pieces of his flesh in their gardens, but his head was to be buried in his own garden. Of him it is said that he outlived the ordinary age, and that no man knew his father, but that he made the Sago good, and no one was hungry any more. Old men who were alive some years ago affirmed that they had known Sagara in their youth, and the general opinion of the Kovai people seemed to be that Sagara died not more than 2 generations ago. Taken altogether, these legends point to a widespread practice of dismembering the body of a king or magician and burying the pieces in different parts of the country in order to ensure the fertility of the ground and probably also the fecundity of man and beast. To return to the human victims, whose ashes the Egyptians scattered with winnowing fans, the red hair of these unfortunates was probably significant, for in Egypt the oxen which were sacrificed had also to be red. A single black or white hair found on the beast would have disqualified it for the sacrifice. If, as I conjecture, these human sacrifices were intended to promote the growth of crops, and the winnowing of their ashes seemed to support this view, red-haired victims were perhaps selected as best fitted to personate the spirit of the ruddy grain. For when a god is represented by a living person, it is natural that the human representative should be chosen on the ground of his supposed resemblance to the divine original. Hence, the ancient Mexicans, conceiving the maize as a personal being, who went through the whole course of life between seed time and harvest, sacrificed newborn babes when the maize was sown, older children when it had sprouted, and so on till it was fully ripe, when they sacrificed old men. A name for Osiris was the crop or harvest, and the ancients sometimes explained him as a personification of the corn. Subsection 2. Osiris, a tree spirit. But Osiris was more than a spirit of the corn. He was also a tree spirit, and this may perhaps have been his primitive character, since the worship of trees is naturally older in the history of religion than the worship of the cereals. The character of Osiris as a tree spirit was represented very graphically in a ceremony described by Firmicus Maternus. A pine tree having been cut down, the center was hollowed out, and with the wood thus excavated, an image of Osiris was made, which was then buried like a corpse in the hollow of the tree. It is hard to imagine how the conception of a tree as tenanted by a personal being could be more plainly expressed. The image of Osiris thus made was kept for a year and then burned, exactly as was done with the image of Attis, which was attached to the pine tree. The ceremony of cutting the tree, as described by Firmicus Maternus, appears to be alluded to by Plutarch. It was probably the ritual counterpart of the mythical discovery of the body of Osiris enclosed in the erica tree. In the Hall of Osiris at Dendera, the coffin containing the hawk-headed mummy of the god is clearly depicted as enclosed within a tree, apparently a conifer. the trunk and branches of which are seen above and below the coffin. The scene thus corresponds closely both to the myth and to the ceremony described by Firmicus Maternus. It accords with the character of Osiris as a tree spirit that his worshippers were forbidden to injure fruit trees, and with his character as a god of vegetation in general, that they were not allowed to stop up wells of water, which are so important for the irrigation of hot southern lands. According to one legend, he taught men to train the vine to poles, to prune its superfluous foliage, and to extract the juice of the grape, in the papyrus of Nebseni, written about 1550 BC. Osiris is depicted sitting in a shrine from the roof of which hang clusters of grapes, and in the papyrus of the royal scribe Necht, we see the god enthroned in front of a pool from the banks of which a luxuriant vine with many bunches of grapes grows towards the green face of the seated deity. The ivy was sacred to him, and was called his plant, because it is always green. Subsection 3. Osiris, a god of fertility. As a god of vegetation, Osiris was naturally conceived as a god of creative energy in general, since men at a certain stage of evolution fail to distinguish between the reproductive powers of animals and of plants. Hence, a striking feature in his worship was the coarse but expressive symbolism by which this aspect of his nature was presented to the eye not merely of the initiated, but of the multitude. At his festival, women used to go about the villages singing songs in his praise and carrying obscene images of him, which they set in motion by means of strings. The custom was probably a charm to ensure the growth of the crops. A similar image of him, decked with all the fruits of the earth, is said to have stood in a temple before a figure of Isis, and in the chambers dedicated to him at Philae, the dead god is portrayed lying on his bier in an attitude which indicates in the plainest way that even in death his generative virtue was not extinct but only suspended, ready to prove a source of life and fertility to the world when the opportunity should offer. Hymns addressed to Osiris contain allusions to this important side of his nature. In one of them it is said that the world waxes green in triumph through him. And another declares, "Thou art the father and mother of mankind. They live, they breathe, they subsist on the flesh of thy body." We may conjecture that in the paternal aspect he was supposed, like other gods of fertility, to bless men and women with offspring, and that the processions at his festival were intended to promote this object as well as to quicken the seed in the ground. It would be to misjudge ancient religion to denounce as lewd and profligate the emblems and the ceremonies which the Egyptians employed for the purpose of giving effect to this conception of the divine power. The ends which they proposed to themselves in these rites were natural and laudable. Only the means they adopted to compass them were mistaken. A similar fallacy induced the Greeks to adopt a like symbolism in their Dionysiac festivals, and the superficial but striking resemblance thus produced between the two religions has perhaps more than anything else misled inquirers, both ancient and modern, into identifying worships which, though certainly akin in nature, are perfectly distinct and independent in origin. Subsection 4. Osiris, a god of the dead. We have seen that in one of his aspects, Osiris was the ruler and judge of the dead. To a people like the Egyptians, who not only believed in a life beyond the grave, but actually spent much of their time, labor, and money in preparing for it, this office of the god must have appeared hardly, if at all, less important than his function of making the earth to bring forth its fruits in due season. We may assume that in the faith of his worshippers, the two provinces of the god were intimately connected. In laying their dead in the grave, they committed them to his keeping, who could raise them from the dust to life eternal, even as he caused the seed to spring from the ground. Of that faith, the corn-stuffed effigies of Osiris found in Egyptian tombs furnish an eloquent and unequivocal testimony. They were at once an emblem and an instrument of resurrection. Thus, from the sprouting of the grain, the ancient Egyptians drew an augury of human immortality. They are not the only people who have built the same lofty hopes on the same slender foundation. A god who thus fed his people with his own broken body in his life, and who held out to them a promise of blissful eternity in a better world thereafter, naturally reigned supreme in their affections. We need not wonder, therefore, that in Egypt the worship of the other gods was overshadowed by that of Osiris, and that while they were revered, each in his own district, he and his divine partner Isis were adored in all. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Midwest Covencast Presents Weekend Reads. We will be back in 2 weeks with our next installment. In the meantime, you can catch up with our other pod, Midwest Coven Cast. Consider supporting Midwest Coven Cast and Weekend Reads on our Patreon to gain access to additional content and exclusive Coven merch. You can even join our Coven by following us on social media at Midwest Coven Cast on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram, and at Midwest Coven on Twitter. You can also keep up with us on our website, MidwestCovenCast.com. Until next time, Coven, blessed be.